we go, Higherside chatters. Welcome to THC, drinking a little drink, smoking a ton of smoke, enjoying a sunny day in San Diego. I'm Greg Carlwood, and today is such an interesting show because typically we explore so many weird topics like UFO abductions, secret underground bases, classified military experiments, child pedophilia rings of the elite, all kinds of stuff. And a lot of these subjects imply that some people might go missing sometimes, either to be tested on or forced to work at these underground facilities, or kids taken and traded among the political, financial, and religious elite, or maybe some folks might get involved in an unsavory encounter with an ornery cryptid. There's a lot of weirdness out there, but usually when you get down to the details, there's not a ton of names or evidence of victims gone missing for these large-scale conspiracies or encounters. And today is almost a polar opposite show. We have a ton of victims of strange circumstance that have gone missing, and some have come back, but others don't. Yet we have almost no story or clues as to why they disappeared or what happened to them, because a lot of the clues we do have completely defy logic. And these could be victims of some of the earlier conspiracies or situations I mentioned, or we could be dealing with a completely new and different phenomenon altogether. One that you could say the National Park Service might even know about and is trying to keep a lid on. Now, when a lot of us think about the perfect getaway from the hectic 9 to 5, many envision a camping trip or hike among the fresh air and beautiful landscapes of sweet Mother Nature. But after hearing about the work of today's guest, that might all change. David Paulides has spent 20 years in law enforcement out here in California, and he holds 2 degrees from the University of San Francisco and now has 3 volumes out of his amazing phone book thick series about missing people, Missing 411. It explores what he's come to find is a shockingly vast number of strange disappearances within national parks and other remote areas, mainly within the United States and Canada. But as the research continues, it seems pretty safe to say that these odd commonalities among the missing extend around the globe. I've had a hell of a time reading about these cases, and I don't think I've ever been more perplexed by a topic that included so much data and evidence that something strange is clearly going on, and I can't wait to get down to it. David, my man, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Greg. Appreciate being here.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, you've created an amazing archive of missing people, and there seems to be a lot of curiosity and interest over the cases you've gathered because they're so strange, but and the sheer numbers are pretty staggering too. But I think there's kind of a tendency to see shows like Nancy Grace on TV or hear about these huge famous cases of a kid gone missing that we get every other year or so. And I think people are under the impression that the coverage of those cases, that's an indication of the amount of people and children that really go missing. But that's pretty far from the truth, isn't it, man? I mean, you filled 3 books at this point.
Correct. Actually, we just released the 4th book a few weeks ago.
Wow.
The topic is very, very complex. Without having a view from 50,000 feet, it may look as though it's mundane, but when you get into the nitty-gritty details of it, you start to realize that there really is something here.
Yeah, and I know you've spent a ton of time in the great outdoors yourself, and together with your law enforcement background, these things really put you in a prime position to be the guy who's doing this work because you recognize the strangeness and the patterns, and most importantly, the way that government agencies like the National Park Service are supposed to act. And they've been very kind of combative with you and withheld some information, sometimes unlawfully along the way, as you've tried to gather this data. It's been kind of strange, hasn't it?
Well, I think it's a strange position for them to take. That's for sure. There's no doubt about it. I don't get it.
What are some of the experiences you've had along the way trying to get some documentation for cases as you compile these books?
Well, again, we're nobody special than anybody else. We run this organization under a website called the Can-Am Missing Project, and we just write Freedom of Information Act requests directly to the Park Service, just like everybody else. And according to the laws in the U.S., we have a right to government documents as long as they're not secret and they don't compromise the welfare of the public. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things we requested was a list of missing people from the 183 locations that the Park Service manages. And to our astonishment, they came back saying that they don't keep track of information on missing people, and they don't have any lists of missing people. And apparently they don't keep track of missing people.
Wow.
A pretty astonishing statement coming from a group that has one of the largest federal law enforcement contingents in the United States. Their law enforcement officers are all graduates of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Institute, one of the best training centers in the United States and in probably the world. So they definitely know the political correctness of needing this information. And as every law enforcement person that has contacted me says, they do not believe the Park Service. They believe they have the information and they're not giving it out.
Seems like the one thing that they should be doing.
Well, as another Park Service employee told me about a year ago, Dave, they know the number of toilet paper rolls they have in the parks. So to say that they don't keep track of everything at a minutia level, that's ridiculous. It's a government agency. They know the importance of keeping this information, and to say they don't have it is ridiculous.
Yeah, and I mean, again, you're just finishing the 4th volume of these books, and these are not just regular missing people cases. I mean, these are cases that have strange commonalities, which we will get into some of them, but these are the cases where you filtered out a lot of the standard reasons people might think that someone would go missing in a national park or out in the wilderness, some of the things that seem a little more mundane. These are only the cases that have these weird oddities, right?
Correct. There's a profile that we came up with after reading a couple thousand cases, and that profile is the only one that we applies and the only one that we will do research about. So say somebody wants to voluntarily disappear, somebody who has mental issues, drownings, things like that are excluded. Animal attacks, they're excluded. Things like that would be the vast bulk of the missing persons cases. We don't look into them. But after reading many, many, many cases, you start to see certain oddities fall out of the group. And again, these aren't easily found, and a normal person would never find them, and a person working on a search and rescue team in a county would never understand this unless you looked at cases, and I'm talking thousands of cases from primarily North America, but there's a small percentage that are falling outside the U.S. as well. In fact, in the last year, we've found a big association between cases in Australia and cases here in North America, and the oddities here have carried over there in the last century as well. But yeah, the normal cases that you hear about in the news, no, we don't work them, but if they do fit the profile, then we count them.
It's so interesting that you're finding this to be a global phenomenon, because that just adds another layer of mystery to it, because you can't chalk it up to just, one group of crazy people in Yosemite who live in the backwoods who kidnap kids. You can't chalk it up to one thing in this area or one thing in another, or even the whole country. I mean, it makes you think that there's something going on, there's something out there that we just don't even know, or a force that deals with people and nature that we just don't have any information on.
Well, and you did bring up Yosemite, so that's the largest cluster of missing people in the world that fall into the profile we've established. Now, there's 52 clusters of missing people in North America that we've identified. That Yosemite cluster is huge. It goes back about 120 years. And you're right, you couldn't say that it's a group of serial killers in North America that are at these different locations that have gone about killing people, because it surpasses a generation. And therein lies one of the mysteries behind why this probably has never been understood or identified in the past. A lot of these disappearances, one may occur, let's say in Crater Lake National Park today, one more may occur in 14 years, and then one more may occur in 16 years. So 3 disappearances in one area would establish a cluster, but that's more than 30 years, and generally law enforcement people don't stay more than 25 or 30 years on the job. So when you look at it in just your career, well, 2 incidences in 30 years you might not think much about. But when you have 4 or 5 or 6 in a 30-year period, it's going to raise the interest of everybody in that area and say, something strange is going on here. It's just enough not to raise the suspicion on a majority of occasions. Now, I bring up Crater Lake because there's been 5 or 6 boys under the age of 14 that have disappeared in or directly around Crater Lake under really, really suspicious circumstances.
Definitely. Do you want to tell us about a couple of those cases?
Well, I'll just briefly say that one boy was with his dad and his grandpa, and they were looking for a Christmas tree right on the outskirts of the park in an area where there was nobody. And they lost track of the boy for a short while. Just after the boy disappeared, it started snowing, and it continued snowing for days. Make a very long story short, a massive search effort went into this. The boy was never found. Now, there is a weather phenomenon related, and it is part of this profiling that we do, and we can't explain why, but in a majority of these circumstances, when somebody disappears, the weather changes for the worse.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's rain, sometimes it's fog, sometimes it's snow, but it deeply hampers the search effort. Now, also in Crater Lake, there's a boy who had a disability, and he had a mental disability, and his name was Sammy Belkey. He and his dad went up there on a vacation. Sammy ran up on a mound of dirt on a turnout where they stopped, and he turned and he walked off the mound. The dad ran up to that mound, looked into the forest, didn't see the boy. Huge search. The boy was never seen again. Now, therein lies another part of the profile on another higher percentage of these cases is kids or adults with disabilities. And we're not talking just mental. These can be physical. These can be some type of rare diseases that some people never have, but these people disappear, and sometimes they're never found. And so people with disabilities is another area that we've started to track in the last 3 years that has gotten some real interesting results.
Yeah, that is a weird one. I mean, I'd say probably the cases that interest me the most, the commonalities that seem most mysterious to me would be the ones where young children go missing and are found much further away than a child should be able to travel in the woods alone. And this happens time and time again, doesn't it?
So I'm glad you brought that up, because I've given many talks in front of large groups, and I always ask the audience, I say, how many people in the room have kids? And usually it's about 2/3, they raise their hand. And I ask them, well, when you had a 2-year-old boy or girl, if we put them in the middle of the forest and we told them to walk out, and they didn't know the direction to walk out, how far would they go before they sat down and gave up or sat down and took a nap? And usually the answers range anywhere from 100 yards to maybe a mile.
Right.
And then I ask them, well, would they walk uphill or downhill? And usually it's 99% say downhill. And so I like to ask you, Greg, since you read a lot of the stories, what is a reasonable distance that a 2-year-old would walk, in your opinion, after reading?
Man, I mean, I would say at max 2 miles. I mean, anything beyond that would seem super crazy. I mean, we're 2 years old. Think of how young that is. I would be surprised if they even got a mile. I mean, the woods are pretty treacherous. Like, it's kind of tough to climb over logs and over mountains and sometimes across big raging rivers. You know, it doesn't seem like they could get very far.
And that's part of the point that the parents bring up in these discussions. They said, well, you know, a lot of kids don't start walking till 12 to 16, 17 months. Now you drop them in the woods with obstacles, creeks, like you said, logs. How far would they go, especially without an adult there prodding them?
Right. That's the scariest thing. That's why I like this little section of stories, because it seems like there's some type of assistance. You know, it seems like there's some kind of some kind of being that's able to pick up these kids and take them to areas that are miles away that they couldn't do on their own. So that's what's so eerie about it. But I guess to get into a couple of these cases, let's talk about this case of Tommy Jenkins. This kid was 2 to 3 years old in Fort Lewis, Washington, found 2 days later. What's his story?
So that's an interesting one. For the people who don't know, Fort Lewis is in the central area of Washington. It's 33,000 acres. And in 1950, it was a big spot where the U.S. had approximately 6,000 soldiers on site and housed. And in the middle of it, there's an area called the American Lake, and it's a big lake kind of sitting in the center of the of the fort. It kind of bisects Highway 5 in that area, and it's a fairly pristine spot. Well, on May 4th, 1950, Tommy lived in a non-commissioned area of housing with his mom and dad, and they lived about 1,500 feet from the lake. Well, during that time span on that day, his mom kind of lost sight of him, and she knew that Tommy was playing with an Irish setter dog named Lassie that belonged to the next door neighbor. And I'll stop people there. Here's another part of this profiling is that a large percentage of people and kids disappear with a canine.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't explain it other than it's fact. And we'll talk about that more later. But Tommy disappeared with this canine. He didn't arrive back for lunch. And if you have kids, you know, your kids aren't late for lunch. They're hungry kids. They come back and they eat. Well, when he doesn't come back, the mom gets scared, calls the husband, calls officials. The base commander did the right thing. He shut down the base. And within hours, he had over 1,000 soldiers searching for the boy. Within 36 hours, he stopped everything on the base, and he had all 6,000 of the soldiers searching.
Wow.
He had helicopters from the base in the air, and he had planes fly in formation around the base. 3 different bloodhound teams were used looking for Tommy during this time period. So the third day rolls around, and a soldier is going through some bush, and he finds Tommy and this dog named Lassie on the beach in perfect condition. And they bring them back in, and the base commander gives an interview. And in the interview, he says there is no boy this age that could have survived the rain and the wind and the outdoor conditions we've had in the last 3 days. There's no way, unless he had some assistance. And that kind of shook up the base. And the dad kind of took the lead on that and tried to question Tommy, and he couldn't get a coherent answer out of him. And he couldn't determine if he was trying to be evasive or his mind was blank or something. But the final outcome was Tommy was in really, really good condition for a boy being out supposedly in the wild for 3 days. And then the other part of that is how in the heck did 6,000 soldiers, 3 helicopters, multiple planes miss a boy and a dog?
Right. Yeah, that is such an interesting case. I mean, apparently it got to 40-degree weather, and like you said, raining. And the kid was. It seemed like he was taken inside for 2.5, 3 days, and then brought back out. Like he just walked right out into the yard to play with this dog. But I guess the only real thing that he said that was kind of interesting is he slept in an area with no homes, and that he fell into a creek. He said he fell into a creek, but he showed up dry. Just so weird.
And again, this one case, if you read it on its own, you could roll it through your mind and say, you know what, maybe he found some shelter, maybe some people housed him, maybe there was a crime that occurred here where some pervert or something took him. But that's one case of hundreds and hundreds, approaching 2,000 now that we've identified, that doesn't make any sense.
And another thing we should point out about the numbers that you're gathering is a lot of this, in terms of documentation, there are issues with classification. If someone is presumed dead because of the elements, or if they've been missing long enough, they're no longer in missing people files. That's kind of an issue for you when you go back into some of these, isn't it?
Well, and that is a big, big issue, and that's part of the National Parks, Department of Interior, and U.S. Department of Agriculture that manages a lot of this land. That's part of a classification they came up with to eliminate these people from public record. Meaning, say somebody disappears in a national forest and it's snowing, blah, blah, blah. They go 16 months without finding them. Then they get a classification called missing presumed dead, meaning they're deceased, meaning they're no longer missing, meaning that you're not going to find them on any databases. As an example, The National Institute of Justice has a program that they instituted about 4 years ago where they are trying to get DNA on every missing person case in the United States because there's coroner's offices throughout the U.S. in these rural areas, many in Oregon and Washington and in California, where they have bones that they can't identify. There was no national database where they could go to them and say, hey, did somebody disappear in a 100-mile radius of here? Now they can go to this National Institute of Justice site and they can query it and they can get this information. Now, in the last 14 months, we've supplied them at their request with 12 cases that they had never heard of before of missing people that we had gotten the documentation and the reports on. Many of them came out of Oregon and Washington where they have this classification, or the sheriff's office or the police department lost the reports and just threw away the case by accident. We got the documentation back. We went back to them. They revived the report. They confirmed that the person's still missing. The Department of Justice now has this information, or the National Institute of Justice now has this information. So I like to say that our work has done some good in this long-term process of trying to identify people.
Yeah, that's definitely noteworthy. On the subject of Oregon, let's talk about these two cases that are kind of connected when we're talking about kids that are traveling distances they shouldn't be able to. These cases are 30 years apart, but only 19 miles by distance, and that would be Cody Sheehy, I think, and Keith Parkins. Cody
Sheehy and Keith Parkins, yeah, both of them strange cases, but in April of 1986, Cody Sheehy, 6 years old. He was in an area near Wallowa, Oregon. It's about 26 miles from the Washington border in the Blue Mountains in the far eastern sector of the state. He went on a picnic with his family, and he and his sister were playing this game called Explorers, where they kind of split up and they hide and they stay hidden for a little while. And anyhow, as it was happening, at about 12:30 that afternoon, the mom couldn't find Cody. Well, the mom, the dad, and the sister searched till 2:30, and they then called law enforcement. And within a couple of hours, this is quick for this part of the country, they had 2 helicopters in the air with FLIR, forward-looking infrared radar, and a dozen searchers were on site within an hour. That first night, searchers got up to almost 75. They're walking on the ground, they're yelling for their boy, they're calling his name, blah, blah, blah. They're not getting any responses. The helicopters with the FLIR in the air aren't seeing anything on the ground. At 7:30 a.m. the following morning, Cody arrives at a house on the outskirts of this nearest town. And this house was 18 miles from where he was camping with his family on this picnic. And he walked up and he asked for some help. And the people wisely grabbed him and said, hey, we'll get the help for you. Law enforcement was called, and he's identified. Well, he made some real fascinating statements. He told his parents and law enforcement that he hid from a helicopter that night. And the interesting part was there were no helicopters up at night, and they don't fly at night because of safety reasons. And he also said he hid from coyotes at night. And that puzzled the people because they were out at night on foot, and they didn't hear or see any coyotes. He was found to be in excellent condition, and it goes back to that statement you said earlier, Greg, where this boy at 6 years old went 18 miles in about 14 hours.
Right.
16 hours.
Unbelievable. It's too weird. And then Keith Parkins was actually 30 years earlier than that, but just 19 miles away, something very similar, right?
Correct. He was visiting his grandparents' ranch, and he was walking around the ranch. He was only 2 years old, and he disappeared. There's a giant search, and people are coming out of the woodwork to help, and this location is 90 miles southwest of Wallowa. in the general area, so to speak. And this was in April of 1952. And the following morning, 19 hours later, after he disappears, 2 mountain ranges, several barbed wire fences, several creeks, 2 search and rescue people, and his dad are in a dry creek bed 12 miles away. And they find the boy face down in this dry creek bed, alive, but barely. Now, they said his pants were torn to shreds, and he was suffering hypothermia, etc. Now, when we read this, and there were 3 of us that read this, we said, wow, that's a phenomenal story. But almost simultaneously, the cops in us come out, and they say, well, wait a minute. This 2-year-old boy is gone for 19 hours. There isn't a search and rescue person in the world that would tell a dad and other workers to go look in a creek 12 miles away. That's ridiculous.
Right.
So our question to ourselves, and we threw this around a lot, is why were they there? What did they know, or why did they suspect that would be a reasonable place to even search?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd have the same question. It's very odd. And not only are there a lot of cases where these kids are found many, many miles away, but also sometimes in mountainous areas, they're found miles up, which seems even tougher for a kid under 10 years old. One of my favorites that I thought, it's hard to say favorites, but one of the ones I thought was most intriguing was Kenneth Edwards, 5 years old, in Rosemont, California. You remember that one?
Oh, yeah. No, you know, the issue is that with these cases, as you know, because you've looked at them, is there are a series of disappearances that all kind of look the same after a while, and that's the baffling part. I mean, these kids that disappear, in your mind, you don't think, well, they're not really going to be found, 5 miles away and uphill.
Right.
And so search and rescue may not throw a lot of resources at it. But in Kenneth's case, again, 2 years old, April 4th, 1964, about 2 p.m., he's in an area near Rosamond, California, 5 miles north of L.A., right near the Los Angeles National Forest. His family took a trip, and they got into this area, and somehow or another, Kenneth got away from them. Well, the parents called the CHP, California Highway Patrol, National Guard, Kern County Sheriffs. Multiple bloodhound teams come into the area, and initially they started to question the parents because the dogs aren't finding any scent. And this is another part of the profiling, is that the dogs on these cases 99.9% of the time can't find a scent. So the sheriff's office moved their perimeter, meaning the area they're searching, from 2 to 5 miles out. And they're yelling for the boy. They're not hearing anything. They're not hearing a boy. They're not getting anything. So a Native American tracker came in. He didn't find any tracks of the boy. And then about 2 miles from the original camp, they find his jacket and his sweatshirt, which they thought was strange because it was really pretty cold outside.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, they find him lying on a ridgetop on a cliff 7 miles from where he originally disappeared, and 1,000 yards from the sheriff's command post, which they had moved. Now, he's found face down, which is an unusual way to find somebody, but a common way that people that we've identified are found.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the original story was that he was chasing a rabbit and got away from his parents. Well, there's multiple issues about this that don't make sense. First of all, how could the boy outrun his parents if he was chasing a rabbit?
Yeah.
How could he get 7 miles away at 2 years old? And how could he find and get on top of a cliff?
Right. Yeah, the climbing is just, it's one of those elements that it adds even another layer of mystery. It's just like, it seems like they're being assisted by something, or we're just not giving enough credit to these 2-year-olds.
I think that if you have kids, I think a parent is probably the best judge about the strength and the ability of their child, and I haven't heard too many say that could happen.
Yeah. And there was another kid, Larry Lewis, who was pretty young, also in California. And my note here that I took says he was found several miles up from where he disappeared. You remember that one?
That's a weird. That's even a more unusual case in that he was at kind of the foothills of the Sierra, the South Fork of the Mokelumne River in Calaveras County. June 9th, 1940, 5 years old, about 10 a.m. His family went up there for a trout fishing trip. His dad took a couple of the sons up the river, and as they were coming back down, Larry disappeared. Now, it's a pretty good-sized river, and so I think initially the thought was maybe he went into the river. But the U.S. Forest Service and Calaveras County Sheriff's Office did a pretty good job in rounding up 100 searchers to comb the area. And they worked it hard. And at 4 p.m. the following day, they found that Larry had traveled through his 24 hours. He had climbed in excess up and down 11,000 feet and 3 miles.
God.
And he was found sleeping in a thicket. Now, I'll stop the people here, and I know you know this, Greg, but in these books, in each story, there's at least one or multiple notes about where this information came from, and the articles and the author, etc. So if there's ever any question about the veracity of what I'm saying in here, you can always go back and check, and you can see that this is exactly what was said. Many times we get the search and rescue reports or directly straight law enforcement reports, and I know it's phenomenal to hear these things, and you think, oh, this is just an isolated case. But that's what makes the books interesting, is that these aren't isolated cases.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And another commonality we mentioned with Kenneth Edwards is he took off some of his clothes. He took off his coat, and that seems to happen a lot, which is a really weird thing. And that would link us to the Corey Kelly case. Not a kid, 38 years old, but definitely had an issue with the clothing, right?
Now, Corey Kelly's case, that's pretty weird, to say the least. But I've actually been into that area of Minnesota, and you won't believe the facts of it when you hear it, and after you go to the area, you're going to say, this doesn't make any sense. It's the Red Lake Wilderness in far northern Minnesota. October 16th, 2006. Corey was 38 years old. He had been to this area many, many times. He knew it well. Him and one of his best friends named Jim Neprud and Jim's Labrador dog went to the area to go hunting. And as the men were setting up camp, Jim realized that they needed some gas for their stoves. And so Corey said that he was going to wait with the dog while Jim went into town, and Corey was going to take the dog, and they were going to do some grouse hunting. So Jim left. Jim comes back in an hour and a half, and Corey's gone. And it's about 7 o'clock at night. So Jim sets up the car, honks the horn, flicks the lights. He's not getting any response for Corey or the dog. And he finds some people that are in another adjoining camp that were leaving, tells them to call for law enforcement. They bring in massive amount of troops from the Beltrami County Sheriffs and state troopers, and there's a massive search for 2 weeks. Now, if you stop for a second and think that how far can Corey Kelly get in an hour and a half?
Mm-hmm.
And how far would he really want to go in an hour and a half, knowing his buddy's going to be back and they're going to make dinner? So all the indications are that this was going to be just a short, maybe go out a couple 100 yards with the dog and look around. And if you see a grouse, great. If not, come on back and let's make dinner. But that's not what happened. And the dog didn't respond to all the yells and things that Neprud was giving for his dog, which was strange. So on October 25th, 9 days after Corey disappears, some searchers were 9 miles away, and they find the lab wandering in the woods. And it's dehydrated and hungry. Now, one thing about being dehydrated that didn't make any sense to the searchers and doesn't make any sense to me is that there is more water in this area of the Red Lake Wilderness than you can imagine. It's a very swampy, boggy area where there's no way a dog should ever be dehydrated. And hungry, I suppose that could be true if it hadn't had anything to eat. But they took the dog to a vet, and they took a sample from its stomach and found that it had been eating deer. And that puzzled them. So they keep searching, and a day later, they find Corey's cigarettes and a lighter. A key point here. Corey was a known hunter. He carried an adequate supply of clothes and things to keep warm. It wasn't that cold, and he had a lighter that if he wanted to start a fire, he could start it. But the cigarettes and the lighter were on the ground, and that caused a lot of concern. The following day, 14 miles from the campsite, a tracker found his overalls, his socks, and his hooded sweatshirt. Now, when you read the cases in these books, something starts to come out at you, and that is that in many of these instances, people are missing shoes or clothing or both.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people say, well, hypothermia sets in and you start stripping clothes. But there was no reason for hypothermia to set in because Corey had the ability to start fire, and he was dressed real warm, and he had the dog with him to keep him warm.
Right. And even if you did have to take off your clothes for some reason, wouldn't you keep track of them? You know?
I would think. And many of the stories that I write about, these people's clothes are found in close proximity to where they disappeared, even before hypothermia could ever have set in. Many of the small kids who find that they stripped their clothes, the parents say they didn't even know how to take their clothes off.
Right. Yeah. At that young age, it's even weirder. I mean, you've been looking at this for a lot longer than I have, of course, and I can't think of any, but have you ever gotten a rational response as to why people would be missing their clothing outside of, I guess, hypothermia?
Well, it's called paradoxical undressing, and it's paradoxical because they can't figure it out.
Right.
And so I think there's a little more to this than everyone kind of understands, in that it's a convenient answer to a very complex scenario. And as you'll see, so about October 30th, about 14 days after the search started, snow is falling. They hamper the search. And again, dogs, canines coming into the field, they can't pick up a scent. And so this goes off and on for another 2 weeks, and finally, the efforts to find Corey are terminated on November 23rd. On April 28th, snow starts to melt, things start to come open again, and the sheriff gets in a helicopter, and they start flying the area around where they found his clothes. And in some real high reeds, about 15 feet off a nearby trail, they find Corey laying nearly naked in the reeds.
Huh.
So, does it make sense to anybody what happened to Corey Kelly? No. And the sheriff made a statement that he thought that Corey must have died that first night. And he has no reason why he made that statement. He has no justification. And Corey's mother was interviewed, and she said, I don't believe my son even could have made it 14 miles through the woods to where he was found in that first night.
Mm-hmm.
And better question is, why would he?
Yeah, right. It doesn't make logical sense. And I just think taking off shoes, I mean, that is just the worst idea if you're outside. Your feet are very sensitive. You can't travel without shoes. It just seems like of all the things you'd want to keep if you weren't well equipped to be out there is your shoes.
So as I've told this before, and our group has talked about this at length. What's the one thing about shoes that may be different about everything else we wear on our body? And I always ask people to think about this. And the one thing we've come up with, and we're not saying this is a reason or it's not, but the one thing about shoes that's different than everything else we wear is it's probably the one place on our body that has the most bacteria. And I don't know what it means, but that is the one thing that's different.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I've also thought about that, because I know for a while I was listening to your interviews and you would bring up these feet that were washing up in Nova Scotia. I think something like over a dozen or a couple dozen feet in shoes have washed up on the coast. And I would think the same thing. What's different about shoes, and why are there feet in shoes and no bodies? And my thought process then was that the creatures of the sea maybe are eating the bodies, but the shoes are too tough because of the rubber. The shoes are a little harder to get through. I don't know, but yeah, it doesn't make sense in either case.
No, and the weird part about those British Columbia, there's I think 8 or 10 cases now in British Columbia, and I only know of one case where they've been able to identify whose foot it was. So I think that's a perplexing scenario that they can't, even though they have good DNA, they can't seem to identify these people. It makes you wonder where they came from or what happened.
Yeah, it's such a weird thing. And another case that was super interesting of a kid had gone missing. You know, we've talked about several of these people are so far from where they're supposed to be. You think that it'd be something assisted, but you never get any kind of indication that might be the case. But there is one story where there is a slight inclination that there might have been something intelligent involved moving something, and that would be Dennis Martin's case.
Now, Dennis's case is the longest case I've ever written about in any book, and it's something that I mean, one of the only cases I've ever proactively sought out the parents, and probably the hardest case I've ever sat down to write because it hurt me to write it. But June 14th, 1964, Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Dennis was 6 years old. He was with his dad and his grandpa and his brother, and they were spending a Father's Day outing at a location called Spence Field. Spence Field sits up about 1,500 feet from the lower elevations of the park. It's a very serene area. You got to walk into it. You can't drive to it. The family hiked in, the four men, and they set up in this kind of grassy area, and the two boys were playing. His grandpa and dad were sitting there watching them. And there's a lot of really, really strange things that happen with this case that nobody could ever explain, and the odds would be phenomenal. But as they're in the middle of this wilderness setting in this meadow, another family comes up to the Martins and asks them if their boys and their family could play with the Martin boys. Mr. Martin stood up, shook their hand, and goes, "Hey, my name's so-and-so Martin." And this family turned around and said, "Oh, wow, our last name's the Martins as well."
Huh.
Now, what would be those odds? You know, you think about that. That's pretty strange. And through the Spence Field area runs the Appalachian Trail. And during the years, I've written a lot about the Appalachian Trail and the unusual things that have happened along it. And there's many strange things. But through Great Smoky Mountain National Park in this area, the trail runs. So the families sit down and the boys start playing a game of hide and seek. And Mr. Martin tells me that he's sitting in the chair and he watches Dennis go up to this bush right on the edge of the wilderness at the end of this meadow. And Dennis hides behind the bush, and he goes, "I'm looking at it. I'm about 50, 60 feet away." And he says, everybody comes out from playing hide and seek, and Dennis doesn't come out. So he says, I call the name, and then I start walking over to the bush, and I get behind the bush, and Dennis isn't there. And he goes, something in my gut told me something really bad happened. And the Appalachian Trail is right next to where Dennis was, and Mr. Martin took off. He was in excellent shape. He took off running for 2 miles down the Appalachian Trail as everyone else is looking for the boy. And he comes back, and nobody can find him. So the grandpa takes a quick stroll down the mountain to get help as everyone continues to look for Dennis. Now, simultaneously as this is going on, a family from outside the area drives into Great Smoky Mountain National Park and goes up to a ranger and asks them where they can go, where they can see bears. And the ranger says, hey, you go to this area right outside of Cades Cove called Rowan's Creek, and there's a lot of wildlife there. You should be able to see something. Family says, okay. So family parks their car, and they start walking up this valley. I've been in the valley. It's pretty thick, pretty rugged, beautiful. And this is another unusual coincidence. The last name of this family is the Key family, K-E-Y. And astonishingly, in the opinion of many, this is the key point of this case. As the family is walking up Rowan's Creek, their 12-year-old son says, wow, Dad, look at that. And he points up a hill that's in front of him. Says, I think I see a bear. At about this time, this family hears this scream, described as earth-shattering, the loudest scream they've ever heard in their life. And they look up the hill, and they see this thing hiding behind trees, apparently trying to avoid detection by the family. Mm. And the dad says, well, son, I don't think that's a bear. I think that's a man. And this thing continues to dodge the trees, but the people get a pretty good look at it. And eventually they lose sight of it, and they go back to their car. Now, at 8:30 that night, the disappearance of Dennis happened at 4:30. At 8:30 that night, the rain starts to fall, and it falls hard at a rate that by midnight there was 2.5 inches of rain in the park, and it continued to rain like that for the next 7 days. Now, there was a huge response from the U.S. Air Force, National Park Service, local jurisdictions, etc. Now, Dwight McCarter eventually was the head tracker for the National Park Service in Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and he wrote a book about tracking. And he's been interviewed a couple of times about this case. And we actually went out and interviewed him. He's retired now, and he has a great memory. He goes, I'll never forget this. He said, I was one of the liaisons between Mr. Martin and the National Park Service. So I'll get back to Dwight. But as the search is going on, helicopters are flying in and out, and 2 big helicopters come into the park filled with the Green Beret Special Forces. Now, there's rumors out there that, they were training nearby and just happened to stop by. The reality of it is, I have a file probably 4 inches thick from the National Park Service on this, and nobody that I could ever determine called them. Nobody asked them to come into the search. Nobody gave them permission to land in the park, but they showed up. And McCarter told me that when they came in, they set up their own camp away from everyone else with their own communication systems. And when the National Park Service says, well, why don't we put 3 of your guys with 1 of our guys since we know the area and we could be more efficient searching, they said, no, we'll search by ourselves. Very, very strange, according to McCarter, that no other group had ever done that before. So at the maximum point, there were almost 1,400 searchers inside the park looking for Dennis. And the FBI sent an agent to, quote-unquote, monitor the case, but they didn't suspect that the crime had occurred, but he was going to monitor the case. So the day after Dennis disappears, on the front of the Knoxville Times is a picture of Dennis Martin about this disappearance. The Key family reads it and says, wow, the times are kind of close. I wonder if what we saw on the mountain had something to do with Dennis's disappearance, since it was almost directly below where he disappeared.
Right.
So the FBI sends an agent and a ranger to contact the Key family, and the Key family says, hey, we'll meet you at the park, and we'll show you the point where we saw this, and you can kind of see the distances and things. FBI says, no, we'll meet you at your house or somewhere in between, but don't come to the park, which is wrong, because as an investigator, you want to see the distances and see if they could see what they claim to see. And so it seemed odd. And Mr. Martin had an agreement with the FBI and the Park Service that any leads that they had on this case, that they would immediately come to him and tell him. He never left the park. He stayed in the park for 6 weeks, nonstop, helping, looking, kind of being the eyes and ears. He's an architect. He's a very smart man. And I think he did the right thing by staying there and monitoring the situation. But make a long story short, that Key family observation wasn't told to him by the FBI or the Park Service. A reporter happened to hear about it from another source, went out and interviewed the Key family, came back and told Mr. Martin that, hey, the FBI has already interviewed this family, and you ought to get on this. This sounds like an interesting lead. So Mr. Martin confronts him, and he gets told a series of lies. He gets told that the time frames couldn't work. He gets told that it wasn't a substantiated sighting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he gets mad. So he gets a hold of McCarter, and he says, hey, Dwight, he says, they're saying that the times don't match up, blah, blah, blah. And McCarter says, well, I think they do. He says, let's you and me just move at a quick pace, but let's see if we could do it. Mm-hmm. The following day they do it, and they do it within the time frame that the Key family saw what they saw. This makes Mr. Martin even more mad that they're outright lying to him now. So he gets a hold, and he actually gets an opportunity to talk to the Key family, and the irritation gets worse. Make a long story short, the Park Service doesn't tell him the truth. They're evasive with their answers. He gets the feeling that he's never told the truth from the beginning. He told me he had the feeling that somebody was pulling strings at the upper end of the National Park Service, and that the superintendent was merely a mouthpiece. That was his words.
Man.
So if this was your son, can you imagine how irate you'd be at this point?
Right, of course.
So after 2 months, everything starts to wind down. There's rumors that there was a shoe print found somewhere. They didn't really find anything worth a darn. And from what I read on this, and after interviewing McCarter's beliefs were that Dennis was abducted. Even though there's nothing anywhere that says that this was a possibility, he was there at the time, he knew the distances, he knew the facts, and that was his opinion. So I said, well, Mr. Martin hasn't talked to the press since the day this happened, supposedly because even the press lied to him. So myself and another investigator, without a phone call or anything, just went up and knocked at his door. And he came to the door, recognized him, and I explained who I was. I said, I've devoted months to the case. I probably know more about it than anyone other than your family, and I'd like to talk to you. And he says, the disappearance has ruined my life and my wife's life. It's been a compelling issue for all of us. We can't get over the fact we lost our son, and we decided years back to just put it to rest and not talk about it. I said, hey, I came here from California. Can you give me just 15 minutes of your time, because I have some really important questions to ask? He opened the door, came outside on the front porch. He says, Dave, you got it. What do you want? So he confirmed everything that I just said. But in addition, whenever I'm interviewing a witness on a case like this, I always ask him a series of questions at the end that I need clarity about, and things maybe that I didn't understand. And one of the things I ask is that, what do I need to know about this that wasn't in the press, that wasn't talked about in the media, but has been a compelling issue to you?
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Martin says, well, Dave, he goes, that thing that they saw on the hill? I said, yeah. And he says, there was never anything in the paper, never anything in the media, but that Key family told everyone that whatever they saw had something on its shoulder.
Mm.
And he says they wouldn't put that in the paper. They wouldn't talk about it in public, but they would tell me.
Man, that is such a fascinating case with so many details. It is super sad. And if I'm not mistaken, isn't there another detail about an FBI agent that was investigating a lot of disappearing people in that area?
Yeah, there was. And when I started to look into this case, there were several others in the general region that disappeared. But in addition to Dennis, there were also 2 other people that disappeared inside that park after him under suspicious circumstances. And in all of these cases in the park and around the park, there was the same FBI agent that was sent by the Bureau to quote-unquote monitor the case. Now, when an agent is sent to monitor a case, every day he writes a series of notes that get sent to Virginia to the profiling center, where other agents look at it and they try to find matching cases in other areas that are similar. And similar to what I'm doing on these cases. And this agent did this in all of the cases. And after a while, whatever agent is writing it will get responses from headquarters about, this matches this matches that, blah, blah, blah. Well, in my conversations with Mr. Martin, I said, okay, so yeah, the Key family saw this. And I said, wow, that's pretty impressive. He says, yeah. And he says, Dave, I know you also wrote about these other cases in the area. And he said, you specifically mentioned this FBI agent. I said, yeah. And he says, do you know that FBI agent committed suicide? I probably had a deer in the headlights looking at him. He said, no, that's true. And after we left, we did confirm that agent did commit suicide.
Wow. It's like this case of all cases is the one that makes me think that they know more about what's happening and they're covering something up. And the answer that I've heard you give in the past for why this might be is just they don't want to lose park revenue because it is such a huge thing for their states and everyone wants just the nice cuddly image of Smokey the Bear. They don't want to think about anything else dangerous out there.
Well, one of the things in the latest book that I wrote about is I got pretty lucky. I was in a national park, maybe it's 1.5 years, 2 years ago now, with another investigator. And we were listening to a group of rangers talk in a small shed at this national park. I just stood in the doorway and listened, and there were a couple of guys in plain clothes that were also chiming in, older guys. And I could tell this one guy really knew a lot, and he was either a retired ranger or something. But I followed him out into the parking lot and I introduced myself, and we ended up having this lengthy conversation. And he was a retired special agent from the National Park Service. And what that is law enforcement rangers do that first contact on a victim or a suspect in the field, and the special agents inside the Park Service are the follow-up entity. They're like the detectives that do the long-term investigative work. And this guy was a retired special agent for the Park Service. And I explained to him the type of work we'd been doing and the results we had and the responses. And he looked me in the eye after I said, why would the National Park Service take this position? And to quote him directly, he said, Dave, it's a complete lack of integrity. And when a family is at its lowest possible point and they look to law enforcement and they look to the government for support, and they get lies and evasiveness, can you imagine what that would do to you as a person at that lowest point in your life?
Right. I mean, we deal with a lot of issues on this show that involve distrusting government agencies, but man, to think that you would have trusted the government the whole time, and then when you really need them, you never thought you would, and you face these kind of roadblocks just to get information about your own relatives. It's very sad.
It's completely debilitating. I mean, I talked to Mr. Martin about it, and I don't know how he didn't go completely crazy on the Park Service for what they did to him.
Right.
And he told me, he said, Dave, this is the reason why I don't trust the press and I don't trust the government. He said, they lied to me, they were evasive. He said, the only guy that was even was honest to me was Dwight McCarter. He said, he tried to help me understand, but even he couldn't understand why they didn't think at the beginning that this wasn't an abduction and handle it appropriately.
Mm-hmm. And on the subject of that thing that the Key family saw, I mean, any speculation on what that was? I mean, did it seem like a person? Or, I mean, she described it as a bear. Of course, everyone knows that the most famous cryptid is Sasquatch. I mean, it just seems very weird, but that's the only thing that it kind of seems to allude to.
So McCarter, I asked him about that, and he said, well, he goes, a few years before Dennis disappeared, this was a time when the rangers were not armed in national parks. And he said a ranger was working alone in a back area of Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and he was attacked by what McCarter described as a wild man, meaning a guy living off the grid like you and me that lived off animals, that wore furs and didn't have any ethics. And he said that this wild person attacked the ranger and almost killed him. And he said, he goes, the only thing I could think of is that this family saw one of these wild men that lives in the parks, that the Park Service doesn't want to acknowledge lives there, and maybe took Dennis. But he says, it'd be conjecture at this point, but he goes, I don't know what else to think of it.
Yeah, that's so interesting and weird. And on another radio show, I heard you talking about this case, and you had alluded to, or you just kind of mentioned in passing that there was a remote viewer report that was fairly interesting, and I was pretty intrigued by that. Do you have any details on what that remote viewer saw?
Actually, it wasn't a remote viewer. It was a psychic.
Gotcha.
He had written in to the Park Service and supplied a report that was in this massive amount of documents. And this guy had some apparent notoriety for the time and said that his mind had a difficult time going to where it was going because it was such a dark place.
Wow.
And he thought there was a creek nearby, there possibly was a cave, but that what was happening to Dennis was beyond the realm of his comprehension. It was along those kind of lines. Very bad, very dark, kind of almost a horrific scenario. He didn't go into much more detail than that, and I think it's interesting because we have a couple of guys that live in that area that know that park like the back of their hand, and I can tell you that we have done extensive research, and we can't find an area where there's a cave access and a creek running through it because we've made some big efforts to find it.
Man. And, I talk about a lot of paranormal concepts on this show. They come up all the time. And sometimes I wonder if there aren't some strange electromagnetic effects on the planet that we don't understand, similar to how planes fly into the Bermuda Triangle and are covered in this electric fog and are suddenly just disappeared. And it seems like some of these people just do disappear from the scene as if they walked through some type of portal or gateway, as weird as that sounds.
Oh, I've heard that theory before from probably hundreds of people. The issue I have with it is that it is a very, very underlined, very rare event when more than one person disappears like this. And you'd think if that was the scenario, we'd be losing more than one person at a time, or there would be witnesses to that other person disappearing.
Right.
And that
is true. Yeah. Well, I mean, another thought I had is we cover a ton of conspiracies, alien abductions, Bigfoot and other cryptids, child pedophilia rings of the Vatican and political elite, all sorts of conspiracies and mysteries that insinuate missing people, but a lot of times they don't have names or anyone who's actually gone missing for these things. I wonder if some of these events aren't connected with these types of crimes and these types of things that people talk about happening.
So I can only look at it from a common sense and a factual viewpoint, and that is that many of these have occurred pretty deep in the wilderness where there's not a lot going on. And the idea that there's a human abduction process taking place, I know a lot of friends that are backpackers that carry guns. And if somebody's going to try it, there's going to be some shooting going on. Mm-hmm. And you never hear about that. And what I've explained on other shows is whatever is happening here is 100% effective. Because if they weren't, right, we would hear about a mistake or we would hear about an attempt, and we don't hear about that.
Right. Yeah, it's a serious shame. I mean, this should be one of the most important things. It involves people dying, and we don't know why. Isn't that national security? Everyone's worried about terrorism globally. Well, here's people going missing right in our own backyard, and we don't know what's going on, and we don't know who to blame. And you would think that they dedicate a little bit of resources to that.
Well, you'd hope, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Right. Well, David, this has been awesome. It's about that time we called in. It's been a fascinating show. Thanks so much for being here. I mean, several listeners have requested that you come on, and you're the only one doing this, so I'm very appreciative. But before we go, would you like to tell the people a little bit about your website, where to get the books, and maybe what your plans are for the future with this stuff?
So you can go to our website. It's canammissing.com, and all 4 books, Missing 411, as the title of all 4 books, are available on the site. You can also read about cases that are occurring as we speak under current events section at the site. We try to keep it updated with things that are relevant and fit the profile. I don't know if there'll be another book anytime in the near future, but we are looking into some other venues to get this message out. We are going to continue the work, and the only way the work continues is through the support of people out there in buying the books. So it's people like you, Greg, that help us get the word out and have read the work and understand that this is a credible issue that needs some attention. So I appreciate that.
Oh, absolutely, man. Thank you for that. And I would recommend them to anyone. I read the 3rd one, and I've heard many cases from the first 2. And just hearing now that you've got a 4th one, I'm super excited to dig into that. It's super interesting stuff and far different from a lot of the things that are similar in this realm of fringe topics that I get into. So I appreciate it. And the families, I'm sure, appreciate what you're doing too. But thanks again. Keep doing it. Be careful out there, man. You're digging up a lot of stuff that some powerful people seem to want to stay hidden. So make sure you take care of yourself.
I appreciate it, Greg, and I'll try.
All right, man. Have a good one.
Thank you, sir.
You got it.
There we have it, people. Man, I love this show. Dave is so good at giving the details of these cases, and it's really an unsolved mystery and something fresh for conspiracy fans, although that sounds a bit morbid. And it was a lot more work than normal to comb through and pull out specific cases that had enough links to present them as not just isolated incidents. So in the first hour, the commonality I latched onto was young kids disappearing and being found many miles away. And Jesus, how creepy is that? And then for the second hour, the main commonality I tried to focus on was people who survived that mentioned strange things about their missing time. Meeting dogmen and robots and grandma's clone or hiding from the people. Really weird. And if you only heard the first half and you liked it, please consider supporting me and the show with just $5 a month, and I'll support you with a longer episode. I could really use some more signups. It is a pretty crucial point, but thanks to everyone who has. I mean, we're only on the 2nd show of Plus, so to support it this early really does mean a lot. And there were some other cool things that came out of the second hour today, too, like the Bermuda Triangle connection and David's breakdown of the percentage of found alive versus dead or never found. And, I'm really stuck in a bit of a rough place because I want to just give the show to everyone, but I also need to bring in money. And the response has been super understanding and positive. But a few folks have told me they'll never listen again or I've sold out, which is kind of unfair because I think I've done a lot of free work and it is my passion. I don't really mind, but when it is getting in the way of life's necessities, I got to do something. And we're still doing the Money Bomb on the last show of every month. 5 shows a month. The last one will be a Money Bomb winner. So for people to just be like, give me free shit forever or fuck off, That really sours my hope for humanity on a grand scale. Yet some other people are pissed that the first hour is now just a commercial for the second hour, and I don't want it to be like that either. I think these first hours can be appreciated on their own, but I have to inform the people about what's in the second hour. I have to remind listeners that the second hour exists, and I'm trying to survive on it, and it's available. But we're in transition, and I'm kind of smoothing out the edges as we go. But the core of the show, which is great interviews, has and will always remain intact as long as there is weirdness and corruption in the world and people who support my adventure in investigating it. And if you really, I almost regret saying this, but if you really don't think you can afford $5 a month, email me and maybe we can talk. Also, keep sending your music in, people. I've got great plans to create the podcast music archive that helps both the artists and the independent podcasters out there, and I think it's going to be a great fusion. So keep sending me that stuff so I can build it up, go to other podcasters, ask them to do the same for their audience, create a big archive that all these producers have access to, and then independent musicians can start hearing their tracks all over the goddamn net. It could be really cool. But that's it for me this week. I've done my part. Your move, wild men of the deep, dark redwoods and beyond. Your fucking move.
Well, folks, I hope you're strapped in because it's going to be another wild ride. From sunny San Diego, I'm Greg Carlwood, and I'm sure most of us have been around long enough to realize there are a lot of forces in the world we can't control, some we can't identify, and even a few we can't seem to simply detect. Add in the fact that society has bred us to be little more than cogs in the big machine, content to spend the 8 hours a day on mundane tasks if it means a little green paper and some entertaining screens to sit behind for the other 16. And it's safe to say that we've lost our self-sufficiency and with it our ability to navigate or even just survive in the natural world. And that's when it's acting normal. Well, when one of us does break off from the herd here in the great American terrarium, the worst place they can end up is as one of the many mysterious cases of missing people lost to the wilderness covered in one of the books or films of today's returning guest, David Paulides. We had David here to talk about his Missing 411 work back in 2014 when it was really just getting started. And now the cases he's chronicled are totaling over 1,200, spanning 59 clusters, 8 massive books, and now 2 films as well. For the uninitiated, David is an avid outdoorsman who has spent over 20 years in law enforcement and senior executive positions in the technology sector, and he's also the director of the Can-Am Missing Project. Many moons ago, David received information from national park rangers that led him to dig deeper into missing people in national parks, only to find out that many people seem to disappear under very strange circumstances that often hit many of the odd profile points he's gathered over the years of research. Add in the fact that the national park system doesn't seem to keep a list of missing people, at least that they're willing to share or talk about. They're very uncooperative with David's research, and they act damn near adversarial in a lot of instances, and this only fuels the mystery. Yes, in fact, I think it's safe to say that at this point, David's Missing 411 work has become so popular, it's basically created its own subgenre of paranormal conversations, and the speculative search for answers has run the gamut from Bigfoot kidnappings and alien abductions to Native American curses, secret government projects, and portal places. Today we're going to talk about some of the cases covered in the new film Missing 411 The Hunted, as well as some from his latest book Missing 411 Law, Land, Air, and Water. And if we do our job right, you'll be as puzzled as you are paranoid. So without further ado, the great disappearance detective and the father of Missing 411, David, my man, welcome back to the Higherside.
Hey, Greg, thanks for having me. Always fun to talk to you.
Thanks, man. Yes, this is a real treat. I'm sure every host in the game is thrilled when they get to have you on because this work is so unique. You're a disciplined researcher and the case studies are amazing. Of course, your work started in national parks mainly in North America, but also across most of the English-speaking world, and has since expanded a bit to include other wilderness areas with about 59 or 60 identified clusters now. Maybe to get started here, you can elaborate for us about how the work has changed or expanded since our first conversation 5 years ago, Is Yosemite National Park still the largest cluster of missing people anywhere in the world?
Greg, it is. When we first started out, got a tip from two national park rangers that they had experienced a series of missing people in their various parks that they'd worked at, and there was something unusual about it because they couldn't find documents that they were looking for afterwards, and they said that there was a lot of hype and a lot of support for the first 7 to 10 days, and then after the search was over, there was nothing. And they thought that where these people were missing was unusual. Not all of the missing go away deep in the backcountry. Sometimes it's a public area or a semi-public area in the heart of the park, and it doesn't make any sense. So with that, we started off and we focused mainly on national parks, and we filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests against the National Park Service. They stated that they didn't have any lists of missing people, and we went through their National Park Police Department, which are highly trained men and women that are very good at their job, but for some reason they didn't want to admit that they had any lists. And talking to many investigative journalists, they said they're lying. They've got a list. They've got to have a list. Your listeners could go into any medium and small police department in the U.S. and ask the chief of police for a list of missing people in their jurisdiction, and that chief would have a list on his desk in an hour. And after that, we went through and started to look at national parks really, really closely because we wanted to understand why they weren't giving up the list. And we just did a deep dive into archives. And after almost 9 years now of research, Yosemite finally came out with a list of missing people only after I had written about all of them or addressed them in interviews. So that was not a mystery, but no other national park or monument has. So I routinely get asked how many people are missing in national parks and monuments, and I have no idea. It'd be a complete guess. And in my line of work, once you guess and are proved wrong, your credibility is lost. So I don't guess on a lot of things. I try to keep my comments strictly factual. And that's how we slowly evolved from national parks to national forests, Bureau of Land Management, federally owned land, and even some private land now.
Mm.
And after you look at hundreds of cases, certain things start to become apparent. But then after you look at thousands of cases, things start to pop out at you. And when I was a police officer, I worked a few task forces where we were looking at robbery suspects and rapists, and we'd have a big bulletin board on the office wall, and we would put pins in the wall where these people hit. And we tried to map out where they would go next. And I took that and I put it into this research, and I said, I remember a lot of people being missing from Yosemite. And I said, and there were a lot of people missing from Rainier. And I said, I'm going to get a big U.S. map and start putting pins in it just like I did it as I was a cop. And eventually, after several years, these geographical clusters of missing people started to become apparent. Now, not everybody who goes missing in the wild I'm interested in. I'm sorry for them, but I'm not interested. We go through a vetting process. That vetting process includes there's no mental health issues with the victim, there's no suicide, etc. There's no evidence of criminal involvement, meaning there's no crime. Also, there's no evidence that the person, say, was assisted in some way in disappearing. Other things that we vet out are predation cases, meaning persons killed by a mountain lion, black bear, brown bear, etc. Any evidence of any of that found by search and rescue, we won't look at it. And after looking at thousands of cases, there's certain what we call profile points that have come out that are pretty apparent. And if the case doesn't match those profile points, then we won't look at it. So the profile points I've kind of outlined in the book, the most popular ones are they bring canines to the scene. Canines can't pick up a track or they can't find a scent. Sometimes they walk in a circle and lay down. They bring in professional trackers. They can't find tracks leaving the scene. And there's a weather event sometimes with the disappearance. Sometimes just as the person is disappearing or just as search and rescue starts to work the case, they have a weather event of snow, rain, wind, something that inhibits the searches. And that's kind of the 10,000-foot overall profile.
Mm. Yes, those are two of the most intriguing profile points and a great introduction or reintroduction for people. And you are so respected for that discipline to stick to just the facts. You leave the crazy speculation to hosts like me, and that's what I think people like about you. And it is kind of crazy. Some of the other profile points, victims are often found in areas that were previously searched, sometimes missing clothes or shoes. When they are found alive, they have a lack of memory of where they've been. And another one that's weird is geographically, a lot of these are found near rivers, creeks, or ponds, or boulders and granite. And people might say, well, what else is out in the wild? You might as well say they go missing near trees, but that is pretty significant, right?
We think so. And the granite part of it is Yosemite, and there's the most granite you'll find anywhere in the world is there. And that was part of it. And then when you start to think, when I say in proximity to water, I'm talking about close proximity, sometimes to the point of being ridiculous. And I wrote a book called Missing 411, A Sobering Coincidence, which has to do with people that are found directly in water. And you think, well, that's a drowning case, that's pretty obvious. Well, when you read the book, it's not so obvious. And coroners and medical examiners have contacted me and said, yeah, something strange is coming on because we can't find a cause of death on most of these people, and that is not normal.
And I remember when we talked before, the great majority of cases was largely about children back then, and a lot of these children were not found alive. If they were, they couldn't really say much about what happened. I think there was one girl who mentioned that she met a strange bear creature. But in these last 5 years, when you've examined cases where people are found alive, is this loss of memory still a huge factor? Have you gotten any kind of clues to the mystery from people who have survived their own disappearances?
I learned long ago that we won't proactively, 99.9% of the time, go out and try to talk to a victim. And when you go into a new research arena, you are a fool if you don't contact people that are already there and understand where the landmines are at. So that's what I did. I went out and I talked to a couple of missing persons groups, and they said, well, the number one thing to remember is that these people are traumatized. Many of them don't want to talk about it, and many of them don't want to talk about it for years. So if you're going to go out and proactively reach out to them and then write about their story later on, they may feel re-victimized and be angry at you. So I haven't done that. And there are just a very, very few instances where I felt I had to, and I did, and it worked out okay. So I usually get my facts on the periphery from other police officers, search and rescue coordinators, reports that they've written, and I glean the facts off of those. Sometimes even the news gets some things right. But as I've stated in many books, the articles about missing people are about 50 to 75% incorrect when you look at it and you get down into it. People these days, a lot of reporters aren't making a big effort to get their facts right, unfortunately.
Yes, I understand the hesitancy to talk to the victims themselves. The research is important, but you also want to do no harm. And as I mentioned in our last conversation, we focused on the odd cases that involve mainly children under about 10 years old who seem to go missing almost in the blink of an eye when their parents turn their heads for just a minute and are found oftentimes days later and miles from where they went missing. Sometimes they took off their shoes. Sometimes the body, alive or dead, showed up on a previously searched path. And the whole thing, from the distance traveled to the resistance from the park services, was very suspicious. And these child cases also seemed to be the subject matter of that first film, right?
That's correct. And a lot of people didn't understand why we did that. It's pretty easy when you get down to the bare bones. First of all, if you're not a parent, sometimes it's difficult to understand and appreciate the angles we took in this movie. And in that first one, there were a lot of kids that I had written about where they had walked a phenomenal distance in the woods. Sometimes, again, it's hard to grasp the importance of this if you don't have kids and you don't know, hey, my kid could never do that. Or my kid couldn't walk 3,000 feet up the side of a mountain at 3 or 4 years old. So the importance to that is the parents out there, when you watch the movie and you said, this isn't happening. This isn't normal. And that was the point of it.
Yes, I really, really enjoyed that first film. And to get into the second film, this newest one, Missing 411, The Hunted, and also material that's in your more recent books, you focused a bit more on hunters that go missing, which is interesting for different reasons. The kids, of course, shouldn't be able to get as far as they do, and these situations are mysterious because of their helplessness. But hunters, these cases are mysterious because of their familiarity with the woods and their resourcefulness.
Exactly. And a lot of people don't think about this, but I'll throw it out there, is that almost all of the hunters, I'd say 75% of the ones I've written about, are armed. And when you're armed with a rifle or a pistol, that's an excellent device to signal for help. And hunters are trained that when you go missing, sit down, fire off 3 rounds in fairly rapid succession. Wait an hour, fire off 3 more rounds. That'll tell you the friends that are looking for you where you're at and how they can hone in on you. So that's a device that most people hiking don't have. But it's one of the reasons I tell people when they go into the woods hiking to carry a firearm. Now, the opposite end of that are archery hunters. And they disappear at a higher incidence per capita than armed hunters, which is unusual. Now, I also tell archery men and women to carry a pistol with them when they're out there as well. But the archery people and the firearms people, many of these men and women have hunted the same areas for decades. Some of them own their own hunting camps. And yet, even though they know this area like you know your backyard, they disappear. And the weird thing is, they disappear and nothing's found. And I mean, there's no firearms found, there's nothing found. And that makes no sense because an animal isn't going to drag away a gun.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the people that initially have that knee-jerk reaction will say, their mind will go to someplace to make it right. Okay, well, maybe they fell down, broke their leg, and died. Uh-huh. Then one of the canines, sometimes dozens that are brought to the scene, should have been able to track that person right to the place they went down. Other people will say, well, you know, they got attacked by a mountain lion or a bear, and they died, and they got drug away. Well, again, once you've seen a predation scene, and you can go on to Google and Yahoo, and you can put in bear attack, mountain lion attack, and you can see what those scenes look like. They're gruesome. They're easy to find. There's clothing that's torn up. There's blood everywhere. I mean, you cannot miss it. Now, the search and rescue coordinators are all trained on how to find these things. Now, a hunter who's out there, who's a predator themselves, looking for game, they're out there because, number one, they usually know the area very well. They've practiced their sport many times in the past. Sometimes they've hunted the area hundreds of times. They're carrying a weapon, so they're a formidable opponent. Now, how can these people just disappear and never be found? And people think, well, yeah, you know, maybe that happens once in a while. But in my book, Missing 411 Hunters, it's happened hundreds of times.
Mm-hmm. Yes, great point that hunters are going to have way more supplies than children. They're going to be way more equipped. So when no trace is found, that's even stranger. And never a shot fired in the vast majority of these cases. So they definitely don't see whatever this problem is coming. They don't even fire shots off to signal they're lost. There are some cases in the film that it doesn't even seem like the person realized they were lost because of some of the strange details. As you said, they don't drop the gun or anything. This stuff around the gun, I mean, the more I sat with it, the weirder it was. What does that say to you that these missing people, hundreds of cases, don't even fire off a shot that their hunting partners in the nearby area would even hear?
So in the movie, we highlighted a case where a person was a hunter safety instructor for decades, and then he had his firearm. He was in very close proximity to other hunters, and something that most hunters do carry is a walkie-talkie to communicate with their partners. Well, the walkie-talkie is never used. The rifles are never found. They're never heard going off. So when you put that in a cumulative arena, you scratch your head and say, well, did the person want to disappear? no, based on his family life, his history, and law enforcement saying no way. So what could have happened that would have wiped out any evidence that he was even there?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of cases where these people are in their 70s or 80s, the most experienced of the hunters, but not the most physically fit. And it's pretty clear to everyone they go hunting with, to their friends and family, they aren't moving far. Maybe this is someone that decided to stay back and hold the campsite down while everyone else goes out. They come back to the campsite and that person's missing, which is the strangest because everybody was on the same page that they're not going anywhere and they physically can't get very far. And that's just very puzzling.
And that's part of why those cases are in there, is to make you think, well, if somebody was really mobile, then maybe they could walk out of the mountains. But these people, no. Their friends knew them and said, no, that person's not going far. That's the reason we were hunting in the way we were. We sat down a group of people and we were pushing the deer towards them. And those guys wouldn't get up. They were just going to stand up and fire.
Yes. It's hard to wrap your mind around fully what could possibly happen to these people. And there is one case, I believe it's in a wilderness area of New York, that was really intriguing to me because it hits all the major mysterious bullet points, but someone who was in the party did hear something, and that is a rare insight into some possibilities, right?
The way that story goes is a series of old hunters, like they're all between, say, 70 and 80 years old, maybe a little north of 80, a couple of them. And their sons and their relatives were going to walk a mile, 2 miles out and push the deer towards them. And these guys, there were a series of them, were about 50 yards apart, sitting down, waiting for the deer to come their way. These guys have all been together for 50 years. They're best friends. They own a hunting camp. And during that time, during an interview with one of these guys, I accidentally asked him, well, did you hear anything strange out there? And he goes, yeah, I did. And I thought, wow, okay, because he looked disturbed when he said it. And I said, well, what did you hear? And he goes, I just can't explain it. I've never heard it before. I said, well, did you tell law enforcement? He goes, yeah, but they didn't really take me seriously. And I said, so you've never heard this before? Nope. And I said, so how can you describe it? And later on, he kind of said it was a clank or a clang kind of sound. It was instant, it was fast, and it was while they were sitting down waiting for the deer to get pushed towards them. And he says, in 55 years of hunting and being in the woods, I've never heard anything like it. Well, then you couple that with, in 55 years in the woods, he's never lost a hunting partner either. Now, it wasn't directly in the region that his buddy was sitting, but it was still a sound he heard in conjunction with the time he and his partner were waiting for the deer to get pushed towards them. I've never had anything like that told to me before, and you could tell that this man was really disturbed by it.
Mm-hmm. And it's just another one of those cases where it seems like law enforcement, or maybe the further up the chain you go, some of these odd clues are either dismissed or maybe they're not letting on everything they know. And I believe this is one of those cases where the FBI was involved and it really isn't their jurisdiction, if I'm not mistaken, right?
So back when I was digging through cases in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, I started to see the FBI showing up on cases where they shouldn't really be interested. Now, the FBI has protocol that they can participate in a search of a missing child, young child. But the FBI does not search or participate in searches on missing adults. They investigate criminal activity. That's what the FBI does. Now, when they started to show up on these adult cases, all of a sudden made me start thinking, okay, they're looking at something I'm looking at, and they can't figure it out either. That's why they're showing up. Now, nobody on that New York case could figure out why the FBI was there or who called them. But two agents show up way up in the middle of the woods and just say that they're going to monitor the case. Now, as someone who's worked with the FBI before, these people are the best at documentation. And these two agents went up there, and I'm sure wrote one heck of a report that went to the FBI profiling section. Those profilers look at it, and they try to find similar cases, kind of like what I'm doing, that fit the mold of what they researched and what they wrote about, and try to match it together. Now, when I spoke to one of the search and rescue commanders there on film, he said, the FBI's never been on a search I've been on before, and I have no idea who called them or why they were there. He thought maybe they brought some resources with them to help, but he goes, I didn't know what they were. He goes, I can't even tell you why they were there. Now, the other part on this that is really odd is that New York area, the upper northern New York region, has a lot of wildlife. And when we were out there filming, we thought it was odd that we didn't see any wildlife. And when I asked the search and rescue commander if while he was searching, if he had found or seen or any of his people had come across any wildlife at all, he goes, no. And that was odd. He said, we didn't see any squirrels. We didn't see any deer. We didn't see any bear. We didn't see anything. And these guys had hunted that general upper New York area many times, and this was state land they were on, yet nothing was seen. I think that's weird.
That's very weird. And it kind of jives with some paranormal experiences we've heard about from witnesses where they say it does get quiet before they encounter a cryptid or weird orbs in the sky. And it also kind of jives with that profile point that dogs can't find the scent or they won't find the scent. We can't communicate with the dogs to find out why things are going differently, but perhaps they're just like, I'm not going there. But I think that all fits. Animals are very intuitive, and I guess they know something is going on here.
They obviously have the ability to pick up a scent hundreds, sometimes thousands of times better than us. So if there was one there, either it didn't want to track for some reason or it couldn't pick it up. But in almost all of the cases, 99.8% of the cases I write about, canines cannot pick up a scent. Trackers brought in can't pick up a track. And in this case in New York, that's exactly what happened.
Wow. So as I had mentioned in the intro, there is so much speculation as to what's happening. Bigfoot, aliens, secret government projects, natural portal places on the planet. Have you gotten any closer to an answer in the last few years? Have you kind of circled around a possibility that maybe you hadn't 5 years ago?
Well, I think all of those things you brought up are things that people have written to me about. And I hear about it all the time. I don't think that there's an easy answer, and I doubt that there's one answer. It may be a multitude of things. I did a 2-hour special on the History Channel at the beginning of this year. You can watch it on Amazon right now, called Vanished. And in that, the production company sent me to Wisconsin to interview a physicist. And we sat down and we had a great talk. And the one thing that came out of it was I told him that there were times when people were on the trail, specifically parents, and they said, yeah, my child was in front of me. I saw him the whole time. Then they kind of got out of my view for just a few seconds and they were gone. And you hear that so many times that it came to me that it was almost something appeared to be waiting for the time that the target wasn't in the eyes of the witnesses, and then all of a sudden it was gone. And this physicist said, and I asked them, I said, well, we were talking about portals specifically. I said, can portals be targeted? And he kind of smiled and he goes, Dave, there's a group of physicists in the world that are studying this topic right now to see if it could be used in that manner, almost to militarize it. And he says, I can guarantee 100% there are things that might be used in different words that are portals. But he said, can it be targeted? We're thinking it must be able to be, because nobody that we know about that has come forward and said, yeah, we're walking down a street in New York City and we see an opening happen in front of us and our friend walking on the sidewalk 20 feet in front of us disappear. You don't hear about that happening.
Mm-hmm.
But you do have these strange disappearances when the people are out of view. So the portal idea was an interesting one that gave it some, and this guy gave it some scientific validation.
Yeah, that is fascinating because, as we mentioned, that one guy did hear that strange noise that sounded like something mechanical, like a steel trap closing, perhaps something in that realm. Maybe that's the sound of a portal gun or something. But I was thinking about the portal places hypothesis, and it is interesting, but the government would have to have known where these were if they were natural and then developed them into national parks away from the cities on purpose. But I guess in the case of them being able to be targeted, it's possible that it's some kind of military experimentation or fine-tuning of their technology, or maybe it's not their technology.
Well, and I'll just stay in the science realm for a second. There's a couple of videos that were made by some companies that show their stealth technology. I've seen it in almost a blanket type of format where you pick up a blanket and it appears as though it's directly like the area around it. So you can't tell that something's picked up, but whatever's behind that, you can't see it. So there is some stealth technology going on right now that is phenomenally good that could, you could wrap somebody in something and take them away. The issue with that is that obviously the person would scream, there'd be drag marks, unless there's the technology that you could just remove them from the area quickly using this stealthy type thing. But again, that's something that's out there right now that somebody had brought up to me a few years ago, and I said, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, you'd really have to zap them in an instant, and it'd have to remove everything that they're touching, regardless of its material type, because otherwise they drop their gun, they drop their hat. You'd see blood if it was something really violent, but again, it's just not there.
And then probably one of the other things I get a lot of, and I'll talk about it because this came out of the first movie, is people said, well, it's pretty obvious what's happening to these kids is that they're getting picked up by a giant bird and they're getting flown away. That way there's no tracks and there's no scent. And I said, yeah, but you're forgetting something. These kids are disappearing in sometimes extremely close proximity to the parents. If a giant bird picked up a child and their talons went into that child strong enough that it could lift it off the ground, that would be a huge wound and that kid would be screaming their heads off.
Mm-hmm.
And when the child was eventually found, those wounds would be evident in the kid. And none of those things ever happened.
And the second film is called The Hunted. I'm sure that is a catchy way to insinuate that these are all hunter cases. It also kind of implies that you think something is getting them to some degree. I mean, is that right?
Well, all of the movies and all of my books start with Missing 411, and then whatever the name is. So Missing 411, The Hunted, it was a takeoff of, yeah, the movie's about hunters, but who's really the hunted in the movie? Is it the hunters going after the deer? Is it the hunters going after the bear or the elk? Or are they the hunted?
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that's odd about the prospect of it being a military operation or there being some kind of advanced hunter that's out there in the woods waiting to pick people off on the edges is just how much space this covers. I mean, 60 clusters. You've gone all across the English-speaking world. It's hard to say it's a government project because the coordination between all these different countries, it wouldn't really be there. And it can't be just something in Yosemite because this is happening all over the place. I guess if it was something hunting them, it would be something that has no problem getting around the planet and is just leagues above us.
Well, I think the people who are just listening for the first time probably think, well, this must be an issue for the last 50 years. But since I've started to write the books, I've found identical disappearances that match our profile points going back hundreds of years. So no, this isn't a local issue, and this is not just a recent issue. About 2 weeks ago, I got an email from a woman who lost her husband in France hiking. and it's an exact profile match. Now, I never heard about this case. And again, it may be a language issue. Maybe search and rescue doesn't get the publicity. Somebody goes lost in the mountains, no big deal, and it doesn't get the worldwide publicity that it does. But if this woman hadn't contacted me, I'd never have known about her husband.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm sure that happens a lot at this point, right?
Yeah, it does.
Mm. So another thing I like about your work is how you break down the terrain and the landscape of some of these cluster areas, because those are important details. And in the film, it's translated even better than in the text because you're showing images, you're showing maps, and you can really see exactly where these people go missing. And in the film, you say that the Santa Fe cluster is one of the most intriguing. And I'm curious, why is that particular cluster intriguing to you? What stands out about it?
So Santa Fe, New Mexico, that cluster intrigues me because there's been a variety of ages and males and females that have gone missing there. That's number one. A lot of times it's just all males or it's just all females. This one has a little of both. Also, the topography of that area and the weather in that area intrigues me a lot because you've got super hot weather down in the valley, and then you've got temperatures that are quite a bit lower up by the Santa Fe Ski Resort and higher in the mountains. And you've got elk, deer. You've got a really diverse area with diverse disappearances. But when you get down into the bottom of it and you start looking at the types of disappearances, the ages, the sexes, wow, there's a lot of continuity there that people don't know about. Now, New Mexico is unusual because the New Mexico State Police is kind of the head organization in all search and rescue, which is not normally the case in most states. And because New Mexico has a mandatory disclosure law, which most states do not, you can get documents out of New Mexico where you can't get them out of other states. And including documents, you also get crime scene photos and a lot of other things. And because of that, we've learned a lot out of New Mexico cases.
Yeah, in the film, you cover several disappearances in this area, at least 3. The one I honed in on was one where a body was found near a destroyed camp, naked, face down in a creek, or their face was in the creek. Just very odd. I mean, this is another one of those situations where, why did this person make a camp? Was it their camp? Why weren't they also signaling for help if they decided, oh, I can't get back to where I was, I need to make a little shelter for the night or start a fire? You would think they would also be screaming for help, but just strange.
It's very strange. And in that case, we had the crime scene photos, and the coroner writes a report that, well, the woman wasn't in any body of water and her face was never proven to be in any body of water. I had the crime scene photos right in front of me, and she was completely in water, and her face was in the water. I'm not sure how they could even write some of the things they do, but why was this person naked? Why was the clothes thrown around? Why was the camp in shambles? Why didn't she call for help? How did she disappear? All of those things don't make any sense.
Right, and when you see the actual photo in the film, it's definitely eerie, and we're not talking about drowning types of water. We're talking about just a few inches of water. The whole thing makes no sense. And a lot of times when these cases are talked about, I hear critics say, oh, well, this is hypothermia. When people hit hypothermia, they do have this odd habit of removing their clothes. And sure, that might be in the mix somewhere, but it definitely doesn't explain why people are not found at all, why the clothes in some cases, especially boots or shoes, are set very neatly on the path. I mean, a person who would be distressed and in a hypothermic state, they're not looking to make things neat and tidy. They should be freaking out all over the place. But I don't think that really answers much of the questions, but you do probably fold in this hypothermia element to some degree, right?
Yeah, this hypothermia theory about missing people is interesting to me. I hear about it all the time. And I have a few questions about it. and that is that if people strip themselves naked when they have hypothermia, I want people to think about this clearly, then why don't we find naked climbers at high altitude when they're dead and they died by hypothermia?
Right. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it, but if that's the case, if they aren't found at high altitudes, you'd think that'd be where they'd be found the most often.
Yeah, and naked.
It is a weird one. I do love getting into the details of these cases, but people really should see the film because you can get all those details in the interviews that we can't fit into a conversation. And when you hear from the witnesses or investigators firsthand, it really makes a big difference. And there was one case in the film where I believe you're talking to the sheriff, and he's clearly rattled by the whole thing, but he is walking you through point by point on a map. Here's where we saw him last. Here's where he was supposed to be going. And this is one of those cases where there is GPS data that shows where he was, or where his GPS was at least. But this is such a wild case. And it is one of the ones that makes me think about that aspect of this person didn't seem to think there was anything wrong, even though there's a panicked search for them.
Well, that case is odd. Now, there was some GPS, but there wasn't a lot. There was one GPS signal that was received when he was talking on his radio to his partners. This is another case where they had a radio, and he spoke to him briefly, and then he stopped using the radio. This guy disappeared in some heavy mountains and reported missing, and you're right, the sheriff is absolutely perplexed. A guy who has 25 plus years in search and rescue, and we put him in a helicopter with us, and we flew the route this guy supposedly took. And he said several times, this doesn't make any sense. And there were multiple counties looking for this hunter, and he was missing his boots. During the search, they found his boots next to a creek, again, water. And to get to a point where they eventually found his body, it would be a phenomenal hike for you or me in good weather. But it had snowed about 24 inches, and the search parties come in one direction. He supposedly was going the other direction towards them, yet they never found any tracks going out in the snow. That's clue number one. Canines never pick up any scent around that campsite. That was number two. Number three, he didn't have his boots. So he had to have hiked out in bare feet through a shale boulder outcropping that would have torn up anybody's feet. And it's a 6 air mile walk. So nobody walks 6 air miles, so he probably walked 12 miles. And then nobody can find him, even though they find his backpack and they found some other things of his in that area. In the backpack, they found some food, some water, a firearm, a pistol that was loaded. He never used it. And then months and months later, they found his remains somewhat near the backpack, but not real close. And they could never determine the cause of death. They could never determine how he made that trip. They never could determine why he didn't use the walkie-talkie or his firearm to signal for help. That case perplexed so many people. This body was found just on the outskirts of a giant ranch in these mountains. And the people who owned the ranch, they were absolutely, completely perplexed. They could not figure out what happened, why this person acted the way they did, nothing. It was bizarre.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned they found his remains. If I'm not mistaken, they didn't find everything. I think they found his skull under a tree, a pelvis bone partially buried somewhere else. Never found his feet because you asked a question about the boots, and that's just crazy. I mean, he was dismantled somehow.
It's hard to say what happened, and they couldn't give an adequate explanation what happened to his body, but when I asked them if they found any socks or shoes or, anything to suggest that maybe he got there on his own, and they said, no, we didn't even find any feet.
Yeah, and you mentioned that backpack. It was set against a tree with his wallet, ID, snacks in it, his gun. It was very neatly laid out. And this is the case that is really just my favorite that I just digested over and over. They, during the search, did find a cup and an open energy drink, sitting out on a stump where someone would just kind of take a rest period. And from that area, you can clearly see the buildings below. You can see civilization. So if you're there and you're lost, you don't have a hard time navigating back to where you were. And that's one of those mysterious details of like, did this person even realize there was a problem?
And the weirdest part about that is, let's say you were on your last 5 ounces of energy and you just didn't have the ability to climb down that hill. You've got your pistol right there. Fire off a few rounds, and those ranchers are going to know, well, nobody should be in that area. Let's go see what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Man. And another thing that was slipped in there without much context is that information from his cell phone was just not recoverable.
No, they tried and they could not get anything out of it.
And that kind of brings me to another thing I love about your work is I interview a lot of people who compile paranormal and mysterious cases, and sometimes we're talking 100 years ago. Sometimes we're looking back at the 1920s and 30s, and you think, well, this is interesting, but whatever got them, if you think of it as a living thing, is probably also dead now. These things are so far back in the past, it's really hard to get the full context to explain, is there actually a mystery here? But your cases, I mean, they do go back a ways, but you're also nailing all these cases that have happened in just the last 20 years in a very technological world. And people have cell phones and GPS, and it just makes these experienced woodsmen going missing even more strange. Do you get a lot of electromagnetic odd behavior with technological devices in these more recent cases?
You know, it's strange that I don't look for it, but when you follow the technology path and you understand what it can give you from an investigator's viewpoint, you have to go down that road. And if there was an easy answer, I probably wouldn't even be presenting the case because they would have found the guy or there would have been an easy answer as to what happened. But it's those cases where you go down the technology path and there are no answers, or there's no data and there's no answer for no data, and there's no reason why the guy wouldn't use his radio or his phone or whatever it was. You just scratch your head and go, what is going on?
Right. It kind of possibly leads back to the portal idea of some kind of electromagnetic anomaly or maybe some kind of field that creates a space of electromagnetic anomaly and devices break and biological beings just disappear from that space. I just can't explain how something or someone would be able to control another person's cell phone if you're hunting them. It's just out of this world.
Well, you know, one of the stories we covered in the recent movie dealt with a cell phone, and it dealt with a female hunter who had a strange encounter in the woods. And a lot of people who haven't even seen the movie, but just have watched the trailers, have misinterpreted this to mean we're pointing to some kind of cause. And the reality is, in the movie, we talked about whether we should put in any of these strange things that hunters have encountered in the woods. And we thought, you know, we know of 2 cases where there's scientific validation that something really, really odd happened to these people. And in that case, this woman took a picture, and her phone took a photo that, according to Verizon, the phone could not have taken that photo. But according to Verizon, that phone did take that photo. Because of the size of the pixelation and the type of photo it took, they guaranteed the photo was taken by that phone. But according to their engineers, the software and the hardware could not have taken that photo. So that explanation, people are probably scratching their heads, but facts are facts. Something really, really odd happened. This hunter took a photo of something very odd, and Verizon validated it and said, yeah, it took the photo, and we can't explain it.
Right, right. That is one of my favorite parts of the film. I'm glad you brought that up because the dimensions of the photograph that were taken do not match dimensions that the phone can take. And of course, the photo's all warped and you can't really see a lot in it. You can see a little bit, but it looks almost like old cameras, how if you wound them incorrectly, you could take a photo that was like half on 2 different cells. it looks like it's kind of two photos smashed together. That's just kind of a blurry image, but that metadata is just so telling, and there's no explanation for it except that it is verifiable proof of something very strange that can affect our technology.
Exactly, Greg. And again, that's one of those cases where there was scientific evidence. That's why we put it in there. And we wanted to include in this movie some of the odd things that hunters had faced in the woods. And trust me, I've heard hundreds of things, and some of them are unbelievable. But the two cases we put in the movie, there was some type of scientific evidence that proved that these hunters had encountered what they claimed in those woods. Again, not pointing to what might have taken people, just showing the type of oddity that hunters have encountered.
Yes, and the last thing from the film I wanted to ask you about before making some room for cases in your law book is the Sierra Camp. You cover some disappearances near it, and they are as interesting as any, but this is also not far from Yosemite, which is worth noting. But there is a secluded camp, or there was a secluded camp for hunters that a small group of guys had been using since the 70s, and they had a handful of strange experiences, including some thing nearby making very unsettling sounds, which they had captured year after year, and that alone is worth a $5 rental just to hear these sounds for yourself. But as you mentioned, you might not have even included these weird clues that hunters had experienced, and I'm so glad you did, because that's not the only weird thing that happened around this camp, is it?
No, and if you think back, actually the camp was occupied since the mid-1950s. But these incidents started to happen in the late 60s, early 70s. And one of the hunters said, hey, you know what, I'm going to bring up a recorder. And this is early 1970s. This is way before digital. And he took some really interesting recordings. And he said, you know, I want somebody to tell me what this is. And so he took it to a university, and he took it to an audio professor. And they ran it against things that they knew already existed and made sounds. And then they ran it against humans. And they said, no, it's not a human. It's outside the realm of what humans could produce. And it's nothing known animal-wise. And they said that it hadn't been re-recorded. It hadn't been recorded over. And the reason that's important is that in the tape, you can hear multiple sounds almost simultaneously, one stepping on another. And the professor said, no, these weren't re-recordings. These weren't laid on top of each other to make the sound or to make double sounds. This is actually as it occurred. Again, if it had happened now, it wouldn't have meant hardly anything, because digitally you can reproduce and do anything. But this was done in the early 70s, way before anything audio-wise that advanced could be done. And that's where it holds its credibility. And that's why it was in the film.
And it really is worth the price of admission just to hear that. You got to hear it with your own ears. These things somewhere nearby are making calls, and as you say, the people who are recording it are kind of mimicking that sound of calling back. And so the person who's analyzing this can clearly tell there's someone near, someone far. This is a human voice. This is something outside of the octave range of human beings. And I just thought another curious thing, because I'm always thinking about what do the authorities know. Apparently, they found this camp in 2014 and forced them to take it down and dismantle it. And so now that location can be kind of talked about, because it isn't this secret oasis for hunters that it was. But that's curious. I mean, I guess authorities are going to do that, but I mean, I wonder what they know about that area.
Good question. I think they just got mad that they had this structure that they made out of logs in the middle of the woods. It was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, We rode almost a full day on horseback to get to this location. There's no trails to it. Unless you knew exactly where it is, you're not finding it. And we were there for a week, and we didn't really encounter anything odd. One of the film guys that we were with, video guys, heard something strange in the middle of the night. We didn't. But other than that, we just sat around and heard the stories and did some filming and did a lot of trekking around that area. And as a very unusual side note, as someone who's been in the woods hundreds of, maybe thousands of times, everyone at that site for the week we were there did not see one animal.
Again with the animals. And as we're starting to wrap this thing up, I guess I would ask, do you have any advice with all you know for people who are spending some time in the wilderness? Any tips for not finding ourselves in one of your books?
So the one commonality, and I haven't found this yet, it may exist, I have not read about it, and that is that nobody has disappeared carrying a firearm and a personal locator beacon. I have two cases where somebody disappeared carrying a personal locator beacon. That is, you can buy those on Amazon for about $200. You activate it, it sends a message to a satellite. Satellite sends a message to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Says, oh, there's distress. They send a search and rescue team, and they can find you within 10 feet of that activation. I have told everybody that hikes needs to carry this. Why? Because if you're hiking off trail and you break your leg, there is the chance we will never find you. And so with a personal locator beacon, we will find you every time if you don't move. So carrying a gun and a personal locator beacon is a combination. I can't explain why no one's ever disappeared, but I haven't seen it. Always tell somebody where you're hiking and when you're going to be out. Contact that person when you're out. Check the weather before you go hiking. Always carry a hard copy map and a trail satellite map if you can. Always carry a couple energy bars and a couple of bottles of water. And the last thing is, this costs you like $5 or $6 if you go to REI or an outdoor store. An emergency blanket weighs about a pound, if that. Very light. It's bright orange. If you get stranded in the woods, if you hit bad weather, you can huddle up with this thing, keep you warm, and it's an excellent thing to wave if you're ever lost because it's so bright orange. But in the movie, Missing 411 The Hunted, we bring in some hunters and we talk about these safety aspects. And I think that's one of the best parts of the movie that I wish everybody would watch and really heed what's said, because I think it's important, and that's one angle in the movie that we wanted to make clear that we wanted to push. And right now, that movie, Missing 411 Hunted, is available for rent at iTunes, Amazon, almost every place online. If you go to our website, the Can-Am Missing Project, C-A-N as in Nancy, A-M as in Mary, Can-Am like Canadian American Project, you can buy even a DVD and read about all of our books, and you can purchase our books online there. Do not buy the books on Amazon. You'll get ripped off. Amazon wants 3 or 4 times what we'll charge for the book.
Right, and the authors get ripped off as well on Amazon.
Yes, sir.
And just in terms of having these things, it does seem like whatever is grabbing people has an ability to scan them or know what they have. And that's so creepy because they're hitting people with 100% accuracy, it seems. There's no cases of, I got grabbed, then my beacon went off, and then they found me, and here I am, and we caught the predator. It's like they seem to know what we have on us. They seem to be able to identify the technologies that people are carrying with them, and that's just a really creepy thing.
Very creepy. I wish I understood it more, but I don't. And, maybe if we talk in another 6-9 months, I'll have more information. Every book, every story, every disappearance I read about, I learned something. So you're getting the most current information out of me right now.
I love it. And in terms of taking the work further, since these cases have spanned almost the entire English-speaking world and Missing 411 has gotten so popular, are there any attempts to cross the language barrier and see if the vast landscapes of Russia or China or the jungles of Vietnam have these same disappearances?
My guess is they do. And there have been some people that were bilingual that have sent me translated documents. That door is starting to open.
Yes, I would love to see that because I do think sometimes our language and cultural barriers kind of keep our data sets tight into what we're familiar with. And this seems to be as far as we can tell with the English-speaking world, on every continent. So you got to assume it's in their world as well, and maybe there would be some added insights.
You'd hope so. But I do think you're correct. I think it's much more widespread than we understand.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious, what's next for you? Are there plans on expanding beyond books and film?
You know, it's a big task right now, just answering emails, phone calls, etc., about these missing cases. And people have said, oh, why don't you do this or why don't you do that? I am spread so thin right now, it's hard to explain for people to understand. I know that there's people out there that don't want to read books, and which is the reason we started to do the movies. And I'm very fortunate that my books all have 5-star reviews on Amazon. So if you want to go out and check if the book's worth reading, look at Amazon. And I'm very, very fortunate that this latest movie, I think we figured out the formula. I think that if we do another movie, it'll be along the same veins and the same style as this latest one, because I think people like this. So if we do another one, it'll probably be along the same genre.
Awesome. Yes, I've read maybe half of the 8 books at this point. They are all very thick. They're phone book thick, and they're just case after case. No wasted time. They're definitely great resource material. I can understand how even for you giving interviews, it's really easy to resource these things in the book because of the way you lay them out, the bibliography and glossary you have in the back. It's really great stuff. I mean, it is basically a case file in book format.
I tried to make it easy on everybody to kind of go through it, kind of like the way you would as a policeman. So there's not a lot of drama. There's not a lot of intrigue other than what is there. And in the stories themselves, there is, but I don't throw a lot of extra into it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's wise. So right on. Well, I really do appreciate your time, and I can't thank you enough for the work you do. So impressive. Of course, as you said, both films are available to rent or buy on most digital platforms. Is there anything else we should say in closing about following up with your work, getting in touch, anything like that?
The biggest thing is right now, I really wish that everybody out there would take a look at that movie, because I think that there is some trail safety guidelines and some stories out there that people would think, there isn't a story I've ever written about, Greg, where people thought it would happen to them. Yet every one of those cases, there's a victim and a victim's family that's living a nightmare. So if you have a night free, go onto one of those digital platforms. It only costs a few bucks right now to watch the movie, and I think you'd be impressed.
I agree. We definitely left a lot of details and a lot of cases from the film on the table for people to check out, because when you're doing an interview like this, you don't want to give away a full movie. Yet when you have 8 books with 100 cases each, it's easy to pull some cases out of there and go through them in minute detail, but there's definitely some things left on the table that I hope people check out. So huge thanks again. Keep up the great work and take care out there.
Hey, thanks a million, Greg.
Well, there is definitely something strange in the neighborhood, Higherside Chatters, and I am so happy we got David back to break it down with a long overdue update. And I field a lot of comments about it being time to have David back, and I don't disagree. I've asked a couple times, but when a person is in high demand, it's about catching them at the right moment, like when they have something new coming out. So the stars aligned, and I like to think we made the best of it. Of course, it's a little bit different to cover material from a film rather than a book, but we had a great return to form in the second hour where we could just outline some cases from the Land, Air, and Water book, including a lot of unconventional high strangeness cases, and maybe some that speak to more specific phenomenon than the bulk of the cases in David's work, which I think are still pretty mysterious and much harder to pin down. But as far as paranormal documentaries that I've seen lately go, Missing 411 Hunted is about as good as you can ask for. It's fresh, it's not a UFO doc, it's not a Bigfoot doc, and it's amazing to hear from people who were on the fringes of some of these cases, or the people who knew the missing victims and their take on this whole thing.
It's really well done, and I feel so bad, actually, for the people affected by this. David obviously has a lot of empathy and sympathy for the victims in these cases, and we should too. It's not just juicy, paranormal, radio, missing people material. It's a real thing happening out there, or a couple of things. And it's damn scary, and there's a lot of very real fallout from whatever it is. But when it comes to talking about it, I like to think that I have a deeper understanding of certain things, like the nuances within paranormal categories, than I did the first time. Like the fact that maybe there aren't well-defined paranormal categories. But another would be the fact that a lot of indigenous cultures just have these areas in which they do not go, that they say are cursed or just contain a very bad mojo. They recognize it, they respect it, and they don't mess with it. Our culture doesn't have that reverence for unknown dangers of a spiritual nature, and maybe this is the result. If these are portal places of some kind, maybe they're not just open to one thing, but are actually exposed to a world of things. Maybe that could help us out with why so many of these cases are the same but different. Yeah, they check a lot of profile point boxes, but in ways that are too different to be the same thing. At least that's how I see them. Of course, we have the issue of these paranormal places conveniently being overlaid within national parks. And it's possible that we have a subconscious attunement to avoid these places. Maybe we have some sort of subtle magnetic repulsion that doesn't register to our conscious minds, and that is how, over time, these portal places become the last remaining wildernesses in an industrial society. Could be that. I also think the idea of an advanced predator is intriguing. Something that learned that if you hang out in these areas, the prey will come to you. But predators don't usually leave people behind to be found, alive or dead. Unless, again, it's some sort of predator of a spiritual nature, which I think is a very real thing that is a part of more cultures than it's missing from. It just happens to be missing from ours. The other thing that David brought up that I hadn't heard proposed before directly was a type of portal opening technology or testing of that sort of stuff in these areas. That really got the wheels turning for me. And it's not like that's David's conclusion, but sometimes I think we do look at government as a perpetrator for things that are really far older and deeper and embedded in our world in ways we just don't understand. Because that's actually a lot more terrifying than some CIA operation. And as for technology, if we did happen to be going into cursed areas, or America as an empire is dealing with some curse of the indigenous people, does that qualify as a technology? Indigenous technology, maybe. Magic is a natural technology as far as I'm concerned. So, I don't know, just something to consider. But I definitely appreciate David coming back again. I hope we don't go so long in between updates next time, but if you liked him being here, it's important to let him know, and that's true for all our guests, so that when they do have new material out, they know which shows have been the most impactful to them. They know which audiences are hungry for more. So don't be shy when it comes to that. And in Higherside news, a lot of people are aware that we just went through this crazy website overhaul, and it didn't go very smoothly, but the team has worked all week on correcting a laundry list of issues, and I can't think of any major problems related to the site migration that haven't been solved. And we have reached the promised land. I think you're going to love the new version of the HighersideChats.com. I'm trying to be not just one of the highest quality podcasts in the strange stuff conspiracy genre when it comes to the content, but I also want the website to be a top level website as well. And I've been doing this for pretty much 8 or 9 years, and some of the tools and plugins and systems that I started with were the only options at the time, and now the systems that a person can use to have something like extra content for paid subscribers, they're nearly endless. So I made some major upgrades to get us away from older systems and transferred to some that are newer, smoother, and better tools to be future resistant. I'd say future proof, but a show that talks about conspiracy is never future proof, it seems. But we had a few rough weeks making updates that will take us through many good years, and I think that's a worthy trade. I know some of our oldest and most passionate Plus members are having reoccurring access issues around the time that their payments come through, and I fix these manually for people when it happens, but for the long term, I think the developers I'm working with are all in consensus that the only thing that will really fix what these people are dealing with is for them to cancel the old subscription and sign up fresh in the new system. Not my favorite solution, but I think people can understand how sometimes older data just isn't apples to apples in a newer system. So if you're suffering from this issue, before you get charged again, maybe cancel and resubscribe if you don't mind. Talk to me about a little extra time for your trouble, but sometimes it just is what it is. Of course, I'm going to contact these people individually and help walk them through this process, but if you're technologically inclined and you don't mind making that change, it would be a huge help to both of us. I don't want to get into the whole thing, but the basic issue for these long-standing Plus members is that the old archaic system used to charge for a monthly subscription every 30 days, regardless of how many days were in a month. And the new system is smart enough to keep everything tied to the same date of each month. And of course, not every month has 30 days, so on months with 31 days, the new system looks for a charge, doesn't see one, and takes away access. And my developers could probably fix this, but it's a policy of the payment processor not to allow for a back-end change related to someone's billing cycle, and that's fair. You don't want to sign up for something that's monthly and then someone changes it to be weekly or daily, and that's not what you signed up for. So I get it ethically. Even though this is only a small, minor change, a change to a billing cycle is a change to a billing cycle, and I don't think we can do it. So we're going to have to go through that cancel, re-sign up process for that small category of people that are dealing with that issue. But what can you do? Like I said, the technology changes, new systems emerge, and I like to put the Plus money back into the business when I can, and that's what this whole thing was. I think it's easy to see the new site and infrastructure is a lot better and more professional, and now that our growing pains are pretty much behind us, come on in. The water is fine. Most listeners know that we keep the show operating at a high level and commercial-free by releasing the first hour with no caveats or asks for donations or anything like that. And then, if you like what I do, we have an extended 2-hour version of all the interviews I do around here, and that is for Plus members who sign up for the low cost of $8 a month. It's simple, everyone's doing it, you understand. But I try to make sure I'm bringing you the best shows with the best guests I can, and that's my job. Not so bad, actually. But we did just have 2 great episodes, one with Nassim Haramein talking about his model for the reality we're in and the Hollow Earth, and then another with Recluse talking about his Jeffrey Epstein coverage. And we got 2 more coming out very soon, one about geomantic cities and the magical takeover of the ancient American landscape by the early founders. That's a bit of a mind blower. And we also have a health show based on the structured water work of Dr. Pollack and optimum hydration. So stick around, same bat time, same bat channel, and I'll see you later. Sign up for Plus at the HighersideChats.com. Rent David's movie, Missing 411 Hunted, across all the digital platforms you know of. And I'm getting out of here. I've done my part. Your move, environmental entities, mysterious missing people makers, and the plethora of paranormal problems lurking in the darkness.